Why some women live in a man's mind for years, the memory that refuses to leave. There's a strange phenomenon that many men experience, but rarely talk about. Years pass, relationships come and go, life changes, cities change, people change, but somewhere in the quiet corners of the mind, there is one woman who never truly disappears. Not the most beautiful woman he ever met, not always the one he loved the longest, sometimes not even the one he ended up with. And yet, she lingers. A voice, a laugh, a certain look in her eyes. Something about her stays alive in the background of his thoughts, sometimes for years. Men often try to explain it logically. They tell themselves, maybe she was just special. Maybe I just never got closure. Maybe it was unfinished business. That deep down, they know that explanation feels incomplete. Because the truth is far more psychological, far more subtle, and far more powerful. Some women do not simply pass through a man's life. They imprint themselves on his mind, not through force, not through manipulation, but through something much more mysterious, an emotional and psychological signature that the male mind cannot easily erase. And to understand this, we must first understand something most people completely misunderstand about attraction. Because attraction is not just about beauty, not even close. The male mind is wired to remember emotional impact, not physical perfection. A man can meet hundreds of beautiful women, but the ones he remembers are the ones who activated something deeper inside him. Something emotional, something psychological, something primal. And this is where the first hidden truth appears. The women men remember for years are rarely the ones who tried the hardest to be remembered. They're usually the ones who didn't try at all. The ones who moved through life with a certain natural energy, a quiet confidence, a calm emotional gravity, the kind of presence that makes a man feel slightly unsettled, not uncomfortable, but aware that he is standing in front of someone he cannot fully read. And the male mind is incredibly sensitive to mystery. Mystery triggers curiosity. Curiosity triggers attention. And attention is the gateway to memory. But here's where it becomes even more interesting. Most people think men are primarily attracted to physical appearance. But neuroscience and psychology repeatedly show something very different. What the brain remembers most strongly is emotional intensity. Moments where something inside the mind was activated. Where a man felt challenged, intrigued, respected, slightly The brain stores these moments with surprising strength. And when a woman unknowingly triggers these emotional states, she creates a memory that refuses to disappear. Not because she tried to seduce him, but because she awakened something within him that felt rare. And rarity is what the human mind remembers. In a world where interactions are predictable, predictability becomes forgettable. But when someone disrupts that pattern, when someone introduces emotional depth, when someone carries a presence that feels different from everyone else, the brain marks that moment, almost like a psychological bookmark. And that bookmark can stay there for years. But here's the deeper layer. The reason some women live in a man's mind is not simply attraction. It is psychological contrast. Contrast between what he expected and what he experienced. Because when a man meets someone who does not behave like everyone else, the mind begins searching for answers. And questions are the fuel of memory. A question left unanswered can live in the mind for decades. And this is exactly why certain women become unforgettable. Not because they gave everything, but because they didn't reveal everything. And that leads us to the second hidden truth. The psychology of emotional imprinting. When psychologists study long-term memory, they discover something fascinating. The brain remembers incomplete emotional experiences more strongly than complete ones. This is known as the Zeigarnik effect. The human mind hates unfinished psychological patterns. When something feels incomplete, the brain continues returning to it, trying to resolve it. This is why unfinished conversations replay in our minds. Why unresolved relationships linger. Why certain memories refuse to fade. And in relationships, this principle becomes incredibly powerful. The women who remain in a man's mind are often the ones who created an emotional story that never fully concluded. Maybe she left unexpectedly. Maybe the connection ended before it could fully grow. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe circumstances pulled them apart. But the mind does not process that ending as closure. Instead, it stores the experience as unfinished emotional territory. And unfinished emotions are powerful. They create a psychological echo, a quiet whisper in the back of the mind that asks, what if things had been different? What if the timing had worked? What if I had said something else? What if we had another chance? And the interesting thing is, these questions are not always about love. Sometimes they are about curiosity, because certain women create a feeling that psychologists call emotional intrigue. Emotional intrigue happens when someone reveals enough of themselves to spark connection, but not enough to be fully understood. It creates the feeling that there is more beneath the surface, more depth, more complexity, more story. And the male mind is deeply attracted to that sense of mystery. Not mystery created through manipulation, but mystery created through authenticity. A woman who doesn't feel the need to explain everything about herself. A woman who moves through conversations naturally, who shares parts of her world, but keeps parts of it private, not as a strategy, but as a reflection of self-respect. Because when someone feels comfortable with their own inner world, they do not feel the need to expose it to everyone. And that quiet boundary creates intrigue. It signals depth. Depth signals rarity, and rarity creates psychological value. But there is another layer that many people miss. Some women stay in a man's mind not because of what they did, but because of how they made him feel about himself. This is one of the most powerful emotional forces in human psychology. We remember the people who reflected a version of ourselves we rarely experience. A woman who made a man feel respected, seen, challenged, admired, creates an emotional imprint because she activated parts of his identity that he doesn't often access. And once someone experiences that version of themselves, they want to return to it. This is why certain connections feel unforgettable. They were not just interactions. They were mirrors. Mirrors that revealed a version of the self that felt powerful, alive, and deeply understood. And when that mirror disappears, the mind continues searching for it, sometimes in other relationships, sometimes in memories, sometimes in dreams, but rarely does it fully disappear. And this leads us to something even more intriguing, because the women who live in a man's mind the longest often share one unexpected trait. Not beauty, not perfection, but something much rarer. They made the man feel that losing them was possible, and that realization triggers one of the most powerful forces in the human mind: scarcity. The power of scarcity. Human psychology assigns value based on scarcity. What is abundant becomes ordinary. What is rare becomes precious. And when it comes to attraction, scarcity changes everything. A woman who appears easily available does not create urgency in the male mind, but a woman who feels independent, a woman who seems content with her own life, a woman who does not revolve her world around a man's attention, creates a completely different psychological response. She signals something subtle but powerful. She signals that her attention must be earned, not through games, not through manipulation, but through genuine presence. And this changes the dynamic entirely. Because when a man senses that a woman's attention is selective, his mind begins working differently. He begins investing more thought, more attention, more curiosity. And the more mental energy the brain invests in someone, the stronger the memory becomes. Psychologists call this cognitive investment. The brain values what it invests effort into. Think about it. The things we work hardest for often feel the most meaningful, and the same pattern appears in relationships. When a man invests emotional curiosity into someone, that investment strengthens the memory of her, even long after the relationship ends. But there is another layer here. Scarcity is not only about availability. It is also about emotional independence. A woman who has her own life, her own interests, her own ambitions, her own sense of identity, creates an entirely different emotional energy. She does not appear to be searching for someone to complete her. She appears already complete. And paradoxically, that completeness is what attracts attention, because it removes pressure. It removes neediness. It removes emotional dependence. And in its place, it creates something far more magnetic, a quiet sense of self. And that self-possession creates a psychological signal that many men find incredibly compelling, not because they want to control it, but because they respect it. And respect is the foundation of lasting attraction, not infatuation, not temporary desire, but the kind of attraction that lingers in the mind, the kind that returns unexpectedly years later. The kind that makes a man pause when a certain song plays, or when he walks past a place that reminds him of her. Because some women are not remembered for what they gave. They are remembered for who they were, and identity leaves a far stronger imprint on the mind than temporary emotions ever could. But here's where the final psychological layer begins to reveal itself, because the women who remain unforgettable are not just rare. They also awaken something inside a man that he cannot easily find anywhere else. Something deeper than attraction. Something connected to meaning. And when that happens, memory becomes something much stronger than nostalgia. It becomes a quiet psychological presence that never fully leaves. The woman he could never fully understand. There is another reason some women remain in a man's mind for years, and it has very little to do with beauty, charm, or even romance. It has to do with something the human mind finds almost impossible to resist. Mystery. But not the artificial mystery people try to create. Not games. Not manipulation. The kind of mystery that comes from depth. Because the most unforgettable women share a certain psychological trait. They have layers. Layers of thought. Layers of emotion. Layers of personality. When a man speaks with them, he quickly realizes something unusual. Every conversation reveals something new, a different perspective, a surprising idea, an unexpected reaction, and the mind immediately becomes curious. Curiosity is one of the strongest forces in human cognition. It activates the brain's reward system, the same system that fuels exploration, creativity, and discovery. When we encounter someone who constantly stimulates curiosity, the brain begins to associate them with mental excitement. And mental excitement is addictive. But here's the critical part most people miss. Curiosity does not grow when everything is immediately revealed. Curiosity grows when there is more to discover. Some women unknowingly create this effect simply because they are comfortable with their own complexity. They do not simplify themselves to be easily understood. They do not rush to explain every emotion. They do not feel the need to prove their value. They simply exist in their natural psychological depth. And that depth becomes magnetic. Because when a man senses that someone has an inner world he cannot fully map, his mind begins exploring it. And exploration creates emotional investment. Every new conversation becomes a discovery. Every moment together becomes a small psychological adventure. And that adventure creates something powerful. A feeling that he has encountered someone rare. Not rare in appearance, but rare in mind, rare in emotional intelligence, rare in the way she experiences life. And the mind always remembers rare encounters. Think about the people you remember most vividly. They are usually the ones who felt different. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more authentic. Authenticity creates depth. Depth creates mystery. Mystery creates curiosity, and curiosity creates memory. But there is another dimension that makes certain women unforgettable. Something far more subtle. Something that happens not through what she says, but through how she makes a man see himself. The mirror effect. One of the most powerful psychological forces in human relationships is something psychologists call mirroring, but not the simple mirroring people talk about in body language. This is something deeper. Much deeper. Every human being carries an image of who they believe they are, and another image of who they want to become. The distance between these two identities creates tension, a quiet desire for growth, for recognition, for transformation. And sometimes, a certain person enters our lives who seems to reflect that potential. They see something in us that others overlook. They respond to parts of our personality that rarely receive attention. They treat us as if we are already closer to the person we want to be. And when that happens, the emotional impact can be enormous, because for the first time, someone has recognized a deeper version of us. And recognition is powerful. But here is the fascinating part. Many women do this without realizing it. Not intentionally. Not strategically. But naturally, through curiosity, through attention, through the way they listen, through the way they respond. They ask questions others never ask. They notice things others never notice. They challenge ideas others simply accept. And suddenly, a man feels something unusual. He feels seen, not judged, not evaluated, but understood. And when someone experiences that feeling, the mind marks it as significant, because being understood is rare. Extremely rare. Most conversations in life are superficial. Polite exchanges, predictable interactions. But when someone suddenly engages with your deeper thoughts, your deeper ambitions, your deeper insecurities, it creates an emotional impact that is difficult to forget. and the person who triggered that experience becomes permanently connected to it. Years later, a man might struggle to explain why he still thinks about her. But the real reason is simple. She awakened a version of himself that he rarely experiences, a version that felt alive, ambitious, curious, strong. And once someone has shown you that version of yourself, your mind will always associate them with it. But the psychology goes even deeper, because there is one final element that turns memory into something almost impossible to erase, and that element is contrast, the contrast that burns into memory. The human brain is designed to detect contrast, difference, change, disruption. When everything feels similar, the mind stops paying attention. But when something suddenly feels different, the brain immediately focuses. And in relationships, contrast plays a powerful role. Most interactions follow predictable patterns, predictable conversations, predictable emotional responses, predictable behaviors. People expect certain reactions, certain attitudes, certain roles, but occasionally, someone appears who does not follow those patterns. Someone who reacts differently, who thinks differently, who moves through the world with a different rhythm, and this difference creates psychological contrast. A man might meet many people who behave in similar ways, but then, suddenly, he encounters a woman who feels entirely different, not louder, not more dramatic, but somehow more real, more grounded, more emotionally stable, more self-aware. And this difference disrupts the mind's expectations. The brain pauses. It begins observing more carefully, trying to understand the source of this contrast. Why does she feel different? Why does conversation feel more engaging? Why does time seem to move faster when we talk? Why does her presence feel calming, but also slightly electrifying? And the more the brain tries to answer these questions, the more attention it gives to the person creating them. Attention strengthens memory. Memory strengthens emotional association. And emotional association strengthens attachment. This is why certain connections feel unforgettable. They break the pattern of ordinary interaction. They create contrast, and contrast is powerful. But here is the final twist. The women who remain in a man's mind are often the ones who never tried to become unforgettable. They were simply living according to their own identity, their own rhythm, their own emotional truth. And authenticity is something the human brain detects instantly, because authenticity is rare in a world where many people adapt themselves to be accepted. Someone who is comfortable being themselves feels almost revolutionary, and that authenticity leaves a mark, a quiet psychological imprint that does not easily disappear. But there is still one deeper layer to this story, because the real reason some women live in a man's mind for years is connected to something far more profound than attraction. It has to do with meaning, and meaning is what the mind remembers the longest. The memory loop. There is a quiet mechanism inside the human mind that almost nobody talks about. A loop, a psychological loop that replays certain memories over and over again. Not constantly, not loudly, but subtly. In moments of silence, a man might be driving home late at night, or sitting alone after a long day, or hearing a song that reminds him of a certain time in his life. And suddenly, a memory appears. A moment. A conversation. A look she gave him. A laugh that felt effortless. And for a few seconds, the mind returns to that place. Not because he planned to think about her, but because the mind itself opened that door. Why does this happen? Because memories connected to strong emotional experiences are stored differently in the brain. The brain does not organize memory like a library. It organizes memory through emotion and meaning. Moments that carry emotional significance are marked by the brain as important. And once something is marked as important, the brain revisits it repeatedly. This is part of how we learn, how we process, experience, how we grow. But when the memory involves another person, something more complex happens. The mind begins asking questions. Questions that may never receive answers. What would life have looked like if things had gone differently? What would have happened if we had met at another time? What would she be like now? Does she ever think about me? And the more the mind revisits these questions, the deeper the memory becomes embedded. But here is the surprising truth. Many men do not revisit these memories with sadness. Often the feeling is something else. Something quieter. Something almost nostalgic. Because the memory represents a time when something inside him felt alive. A moment when life felt unpredictable, full of possibility. And those moments leave marks on the mind. But there is another layer that keeps the memory alive. A layer connected to something psychologists call unfinished emotional cycles. The unfinished story. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with incomplete stories. Our minds naturally seek resolution, closure, understanding. Think about the last time you watched a movie with an ambiguous ending. The mind keeps thinking about it afterward, trying to interpret it, trying to make sense of it. Relationships work in a similar way. When a relationship ends cleanly, when there is clear understanding, when both people move on with clarity, the mind eventually closes the chapter. But some connections never reach that point. They end suddenly, unexpectedly, or quietly fade away without explanation. And when that happens, the mind does not process the experience as finished. Instead, it leaves the story open. An open story creates a psychological space. A space where the mind occasionally returns to imagine alternative endings. This is where certain women become unforgettable, not because the relationship lasted forever, but because the story never fully resolved. The mind keeps revisiting the possibilities. Not obsessively, but gently. Almost like flipping through an old photograph album. What if we had met later in life? What if things had been different? What if we had tried one more time? And here is something fascinating. Sometimes the memory becomes more powerful after time has passed. Distance changes. Life experiences add context. The man who once thought he understood everything suddenly realizes he may not have understood her at all. Maybe she saw things he couldn't see. Maybe she understood parts of life he was still learning. Maybe she recognized something in him that he had not yet discovered. And these realizations can transform the memory. Not into regret, but into respect. A quiet appreciation for a connection that carried deeper meaning than he originally realized. But the story does not end there, because there is one final reason certain women live in a man's mind for years. And it has nothing to do with nostalgia. Nothing to do with unfinished business. It has to do with something much deeper. Something connected to identity. The identity imprint. The most unforgettable people in our lives are often the ones who intersect with important moments in our personal evolution. Moments when we were changing, growing, searching for direction. Sometimes a certain person enters our life during one of these moments, and their presence becomes connected to that period of transformation. A man might remember a woman not simply because of who she was, but because of who he was becoming when he met her. Maybe he was discovering his ambition. Maybe he was beginning to understand himself. Maybe he was confronting fears he had carried for years. Maybe he was stepping into adulthood, and she happened to appear during that exact moment. Her presence became intertwined with that chapter of his life. And because of that, the memory of her becomes inseparable from the memory of his own growth. Years later, when he reflects on who he used to be, her image often appears in that reflection. Not because he is still in love, not because he is trapped in the past, but because she became part of a turning point in his personal story. And turning points are unforgettable. Think about the people who appear in your own memories when you reflect on important chapters of your life. Certain names appear instantly. Certain faces appear clearly, not because they stayed forever, but because they were present when something meaningful happened. And meaning is the strongest adhesive in memory. But the story goes even deeper. Because sometimes, the woman who lives in a man's mind is not simply remembered. She becomes something else. Something symbolic. A representation of a moment in time when life felt intense, mysterious, and full of possibility. And that feeling is something the human mind never completely forgets. When a woman becomes a legend in his memory, there's a quiet transformation that sometimes happens inside the human mind. A memory stops being just a memory. It becomes a symbol. Years pass. Life moves forward. New relationships appear. New experiences reshape the person he becomes. But occasionally, a certain woman remains in the background of that story. Not as a daily thought, not as an obsession, but as something else. Something almost mythical. She becomes part of a personal legend. Not because she was perfect. Not because the relationship lasted forever, but because the connection represented something rare. A moment when life felt unusually vivid, unusually real. The mind tends to elevate experiences that occur during emotionally intense periods. And when a woman is connected to one of those periods, She becomes associated with that intensity. The memory becomes larger than the relationship itself. It becomes part of the narrative a man tells himself about his life. Every person carries an internal story about who they are, where they came from, what shaped them, and certain people appear inside that story as important characters, not permanent characters, but influential ones. The woman who lives in a man's mind for years often becomes one of those characters, a figure connected to curiosity, growth, discovery, sometimes even transformation. And this is why the memory remains powerful long after the relationship ends, because the memory is no longer just about her. It is about who he was when she was there, and who he became afterward. But there's something men rarely admit openly, something most conversations never reveal, because it requires a certain level of honesty that many people avoid. The truth men rarely admit. Many men will tell you that they move on quickly, but the past is behind them, that old relationships no longer matter. And often, that is true. Life has a way of pushing us forward. Responsibilities grow, time changes, priorities, but inside the mind, certain memories remain untouched by time. And sometimes, a man will quietly admit something surprising. The woman who stayed in his mind was not always the one he loved the most. Sometimes she was the one who challenged him the most, the one who made him think differently, the one who made him question assumptions, the one who refused to accept the simple version of who he was. And challenge is powerful, because challenge creates growth. A woman who inspires growth in a man occupies a unique psychological space. She is associated with becoming stronger, smarter, more self-aware. And even if the relationship did not last, the growth remains. Years later, he might look back and realize something he did not understand at the time. She pushed him to become someone better, not through pressure, not through criticism, but simply through the way she lived her life, her standards, her intelligence, her emotional depth. And when someone influences our growth, we rarely forget them. But there is one final truth. A truth that reveals the deepest reason some women live in a man's mind for years. And this truth has nothing to do with romance. It has everything to do with meaning. The final secret. Meaning, at the deepest level. Human memory is not organized around attraction, or pleasure, or even happiness. It is organized around meaning. The experiences that stay with us the longest are the ones that felt meaningful. Moments that seemed to change something inside us. Moments that altered the direction of our thinking. Moments that made life feel more intense, more alive. And sometimes, a certain person becomes connected to one of those moments. Not because they intended to, not because they tried to leave a mark, but simply because their presence intersected with a meaningful chapter of life. And when that happens, the mind preserves the memory, not as something painful, not as something unfinished, but as something valuable. A reminder of a moment when life felt mysterious, when connection felt rare, when the world seemed full of possibilities. The woman who lives in a man's mind for years is rarely remembered only for her beauty, or charm, or even love. She is remembered because she represented a moment of meaning, a moment when something inside him awakened, a moment when he realized that life could feel deeper, more complex, more alive than he previously believed. And those moments never truly disappear. They simply become part of the story of who we were, who we met, and how those encounters shaped the people we eventually became. Because in the end, some people do not remain in our memories because we failed to forget them. They remain because they were meant to be remembered.